A very good evening once again, and welcome back to the favorite Pan-African show, Bottomline Africa, right here on KTN News. Of course, this day is a very important day. It's the World Population Day. It's the Africa Anti-Corruption Day. Of course, Africa marks 15 years anniversary since the Maputo Protocol. I'm going to tell you more about what that protocol is all about. Today in studio, and actually this is our makeshift studio, I'm together with Jean-Paul from Equality Now and Catherine Nyambura from Femnet. Shall I say good evening because we're recording? Good afternoon. Welcome to the program. So, Catherine, let me begin with you. The Maputo Declaration. Today marks 15 years since it was, it was brought forth. Can you perhaps tell our viewers what this protocol is all about?
The Maputo Protocol is the protocol to the Charter on People's and Human Rights, on women's rights in Africa. Yes. And so what the Maputo Protocol does is it has different articles covering social, economic and political rights for women. Yeah. It speaks on specific issues like on governance, on leadership, on issues like sexual reproductive health and rights, on expenditure for gender equality, food security, all issues encompassing gender equality. We fondly refer to the protocol as the African Women Bill of Rights. Yes. Because it's the first place where we were able to, as African women and girls, they were able to enjoy rights from a protocol and an instrument that was developed on the continent. Yes. So it's like contextualization and domestication of the CEDAW. Mm-hmm. The CEDAW is a convention on the elimination of all discrimination against women. Yeah. So the Maputo Protocol is relevant in that sense. Mm-hmm. We have a few African countries, a good number that have signed and ratified the protocol, up to 40. We have 15.
They're yet to ratify. We're going to talk about the challenges facing these countries and why they're yet to ratify. Yeah. Now, Jean-Paul, from Catherine's explanation, it seems like the protocol is not just zeroed in on women in leadership alone. It's more than that.
Yeah, it is an expansive document, and actually it has been lauded world over that it is one of the best. Actually, it is the best, considering that we have different regimes of human rights. We have the African system, we have the Europe system, and the Inter-American system. And it has actually been talked about as the best out of all these three systems because it goes deep. It looks at even widows and their rights. It looks at women in distress. It looks at all the aspects. And then the most important thing, it looks at the African context in terms of development, where we are in development and how does that affect these women and how can they participate as equal partners in development. So it is very expansive and it is very unique. It is one of a kind.
It's one of its kind. Now, Catherine, you've already talked about 40 African countries who've already ratified. 15 are yet to do so. I mean, what is stopping these other countries to ratify this protocol? Because to me, it seems like this is like something that is going to boost women in so many ways.
So lack of ratification also reflects the broader challenges we are having with gender equality and women's empowerment. So some countries have different legal regimes. So what happens is that, for example, in Kenya, if you ratify such a document, it applies as part of the law, especially under Article 2 of the Constitution. Yeah. And so what the countries that haven't ratified, some of them have signed. So we have a much more number that have signed. And I will speculate that we need to do more advocacy for them to ratify. Mm-hmm. Some that have ratified still have reservation. For example, Kenya has a reservation on Article 14, especially the article particularly on abortion. Yeah, a few countries do have that reservation. Some countries are reserving on, there is a very specific clause that points out to government the level of military spending as to why we should ensure that we balance that with adequate investments in essential services, particularly for women and girls. And so I think all is not lost, and why we have a big opportunity, especially because we're still in the African Women's Decade. So the African Women's Decade runs from 2011 to 2020, for which we envision to have had universal ratification of the protocol. So we have 2 more years to close the gap and ensure all countries have ratified. And even those that have ratified, not all of them are reporting. So we have less than 20 countries that are reporting on the protocol. Yes.
Yes. We're going to talk about women in leadership shortly. But John, can you perhaps tell us where East African region is as far as the ratification?
As far as ratification is concerned, Kenya ratified. And because of that, the protocol has guided many laws in Kenya. Like you can remember, we have the Prohibition of FGM Act, which was passed in 2011, guided by the protocol. Yeah. The Marriage Act of Kenya 2014 was largely guided as well by the protocol. But again, the Kenyan legislators removed some aspects which were positive. But of course, we recognize our level of development in the sense of our social change takes a longer process. Also, if you look at Uganda, passed a law against FGM also immediately after ratifying the protocol. And as well, also passing other legislation and amendment to their children's Children's Act, banning child marriage and raising the minimum age of marriage to 18, and all these were guided by the protocol. And one most important thing is Rwanda. Rwanda did something which Kenya should do. Rwanda lifted, previously they had a reservation on Article 14, which talks about the rights of the women when especially the baby might affect either the health, the physical or the mental health of the mother, and therefore can seek medical assistance in the form of abortion. So then Kenya still has a reservation on that article because of, by virtue of our constitution, saying that abortion is only permitted under very strict rule that guided by a medical professional, but again still not very clear. There are no guidelines. The guidelines which were there previously, which were issued by the WHO, were recently again withdrawn by the Ministry of Health. So you realize there's a challenge there. But Rwanda removed that reservation, and therefore grounds of incest, rape, and where the woman feels like this is going to affect her mental health status, and of course verified by a medical doctor, then they are allowed to pursue professional abortion, which again helps to reduce the rate of death which results from these other abortions being done in the clinics which are illegal and not registered. So that's something positive again within the East African setup. But again, we have a problem in Sudan, especially South Sudan, where there's a lot of conflict. We realize that they've not ratified, but still the issues which are there are issues which are covered under the protocol, which if they had ratified and then efforts were made to bring peace so that there's tranquility and there's enforcement of the protocol provisions, then there will be more progress. But because of the virtue of the conflicts and them not ratifying, you realize there are many other issues, like for instance, women being used as weapon of war, being raped by either the factions fighting there and the children suffering. So you realize there are those countries which have moved, like Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, but there are still countries which also need to move, but each country has its own level of development. Like Kenya, we're still lagging behind in terms of Article 14 and the article for reducing military expenditure to promote women development. But on the other hand, also we've made progress in these other aspects. For example, the Marriage Act, the Matrimonial Properties Act, which recognizes 50-50. But one thing again which underlies all these issues, whether the country has moved forth or back, is that to what extent are these provisions being enforced in terms of either the pronouncements coming from the courts, the judgments, or in terms of the policy mechanism in terms of implementations? Like recently, there was a ruling also in Kenyan court on matrimonial property where the judges talk of contribution, yet the constitution talks of 50-50, and this is what also recognized in the Maputo Protocol, that the parties to the marriage are equal during and even after the marriage. So you realize that we make progress, but we need to make more effort even within our systems and structures that enforce the law to ensure that they interpret it according to that commitment we've made under the Maputo Protocol. Sure,
a lot needs to be done. Apart from South Sudan, I think East Africa is not that badly off.
Look at Tanzania. Recently, they're banning pregnant girls from schools. I mean, that is very controversial.
Catherine, let's talk about women in leadership. You've talked, Jean-Paul has already mentioned Rwanda. This is a country that is, I mean, it has one of the biggest women representation in parliament. The last time I checked, it was about 65%. So the main question everybody has been asking is, why can this trickle down to other African countries? And what is Rwanda doing right, perhaps?
It goes beyond the presentation to also how we work with changing social norms and changing attitudes, because we have to recognize that a lot of what we are faced up against is patriarchal norms, right? In a context where we are discussing gender equality and progress, in societies where predominantly we've had male leadership and a lot more investment in boys as opposed to girls, and we are really making headway in different aspects of that. So I think if you look at leadership, it has to come from a much more broad-based outlook and investment. So for example, investing in girls' education and ensuring they are not just being retained, but also completing and transitioning within the education system. Because women who are able to contest in leadership have to be able to articulate their vision, have to be able to have the confidence that comes with going through an education system. And secondly also is that I think legislation at a national level does help to, for example, to create affirmative action. We've seen that in the case of Kenya, where we now have 47 women leaders who are guaranteed representation in the parliament through affirmative action, and that's very progressive. And I think if you look at countries like Senegal, there has been legislation across different ways as to how you can make this. It's a groundswell. It takes a long time, but it's not just a one-time investment. It's investment all around. It's ensuring we invest in critical areas of health, critical areas of education, again working with our societies to change social norms and start to ensure that we are putting women in, as leaders. And then it goes beyond election. We have to deliberately have political will from governments to select and elect women and position women as leaders in different aspects, in cabinets, in cabinet position, in parastatals, so that when we are auditing our governments for gender equality, we're not just auditing the parliament.
The private sector as well.
Yes.
And entrepreneurs.
And for
because
example,
that is
women
where
in
most
boards.
women are also sidelined.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, Jean, can you perhaps take us through this? Because the just concluded election, the 2017 election, we've seen a couple of women governors who were elected into office. And then we've seen members of parliament, women members of parliament coming from, places like northern Kenya, places like Samburu. What does this say about Kenya?
This says that the Kenyans are appreciating leadership of the women, and that's why there's an increase. But again, we've not yet reached where we are supposed to be, because remember, even the Constitution talks of 2/3 majority in all these houses, but we've not yet achieved that. So there's a level of enlightenment and awareness among the population, and this is largely because of the civil society and the organizations that keep on stressing and highlighting where women do very well, so that the public becomes aware that actually women can lead equally just as men. So that is on the other hand. On the other aspect also, there is the underlying concept that it is not just about the numbers, it is about the ideologies, it's about the results, the outcome of that particular leadership. Because the numbers, well, they can be achieved even through nominations. But when there's a competitive process and brings on board people who have decided that they want to lead and they have a track record, and we can quote so many women out there. We have women governors, we have deputy governors as well, we have women ministers. So this shows that the Kenyan leadership and the populace, they already have an awareness on the leadership of women, but in terms of delivery and in terms of also looking at the appointments being done by either the executive or even the different sectors of the government, then it shows that still we've not achieved where we are supposed to be, what we talk of the 50-50. It has not yet, we are yet to be there, and that's why we are keeping on fighting on this and pushing on different sectors of the government to keep on strengthening, and even by strengthening other sectors like education, that's how we can achieve this progressively, because the leaders who are there, the women who are there, they'll retire, then we need also a new crop to come in. Yeah, and that's how progressively this can be achieved.
Now, Catherine, apparently in the current parliament in Kenya, there's a woman rep who wants to sponsor a bill to scrap off the woman representative position. And of course, one of the reasons members of parliament have raised this is because they feel like, the women representatives are some sort of pain when it comes to taxpayers, the ballooning wage bill and everything. Why do you think there's this kind of a feeling where people feel like the woman representative are some sort of a burden to the economy, to the country?
And so I started off earlier speaking about social norms and attitudes and patriarchal attitudes. And for me, what this highlights is how women leaders are perceived, and the level of commitment and the level of analysis and even spotlight on women leaders. There's a much more higher burden on them to deliver as opposed to their male counterparts. There's a much higher burden of morality that's expected of more women leaders. That's quite gender biased.
Actually, the one who's sponsoring the bill is a woman. I don't know.
And I agree with you in terms of, I think the discussion here is patriarchy, not women or men. All of us, men and women, have all been socialized in a patriarchal society. So it's all about attitudes and how we work progressively to change that. And this bill may pose a challenge, especially in terms of as we work towards affirmative action. Affirmative action is not it's not a long-term attitude. It's not a long-term measure. It's a temporary measure as we work towards working on elections, as we work on making sure that by the time we finish with implementing the affirmative action, we will have women who are able to join the system through election. But before we get there, we have to ensure we are creating, we are legitimizing the space for them to occupy those spaces. Both women, people with disability, and young people. So we definitely have a bigger spotlight on women because of that patriarchal angle, but you can also go and discuss young people who are more than 70% but are rarely represented. But when they are, there's so much question about their representation or people with disabilities. So I think the issue to focus on here is attitudes towards women leadership and how we can collectively work towards changing those attitudes so that we don't see women leaders as a burden, as a tax burden for people.
Paul, you've had Catherine's explanation there. Are you foreseeing a situation where Kenya might one day get a woman president?
Sure, why
We've seen
not?
presidential candidates before.
Yeah, definitely. We've seen Ngilu, we've seen Martha Karua, and we believe there are many more coming. It will take some time, yes. We agree that because of the practicalities and what she has rightfully mentioned, patriarchy, both men and women. It is not only men who are patriarchal, it's even women also to some extent. There are women who are patriarchal because of the socialization, because they are brought up in this society where men have been dominating and have certain privileges, and therefore certain centers of power are rotating around men, and therefore even them to some extent we realize, even the television shows, sometimes the ones we air, you realize sometimes we realize that television shows which practically portray the man as the head of everything.
Sometimes we don't have even women prime.
Yes, so
I accept that.
It is in the whole sector of the society. Yeah. But I agree that progress is being made, and I thank God that in 2010 we passed a constitution which is very progressive, not only for the country but also in the whole of Africa. It has been an example. So it is just the political goodwill for us to be able to enforce what is provided for in that constitution. Because if we enforce, for example, the two-third gender rule, I'm sure we will have achieved something, so that by the time a woman candidate makes the decision to stand for the presidency, then even the population feels like, yes, I mean, this is workable, this is possible. But at the moment, remember also, if you look at the political life of most of our politicians, there are so many challenges. But when you compare the male candidate and the female candidate, then you realize the female candidate goes through a lot of challenges. Just an example, in the past election, you realize if somebody comes up as a woman and says, I want to vie, there are so many names that are thrown out, either prostitute, and you realize that these are things which people talk about. And as a person, they impact on you. And therefore, it makes many other women shy away unless they are strong enough and they've been empowered enough to be able to resist all this. Look at the life, for example, the other lady. There was another lady who also wanted to stand for county rep, and she was somehow attacked and intimidated. So you realize that there are a lot of forces which are against women leadership. But I thank God that among the society also, there are those also who support. And there are also channels, and there are also structures that support either financially, to empower women to be able to be at the leadership position. So the journey is long, but yes, it can happen.
Sure. Now, Catherine, of course, you're marking 15 years anniversary since the Maputo Protocol. But at the same time, I've already mentioned earlier in the show, today is World Population Day. At the same time is Africa's Anti-Corruption Day. These are two issues that, in a huge way, affect the livelihood of women, right? In this continent.
Yes. And so I'll start with the World Population Day. So today is 50 years ago is when family planning was recognized as a human right. And that's important because as part of the Maputo Protocol Article 14, there are provisions as to what level of support governments should provide for women and girls in terms of availing and guaranteeing sexual reproductive health and rights. And so this is why Maputo Protocol is lauded globally. It has a very high standard in terms of defining family planning as a human right, the women's rights to control their own fertility. These are the things we are discussing on the continent, so that women have bodily integrity, they have bodily autonomy, and the agency and control over their own lives. So we have women dying currently through maternal mortality, through unsafe abortions. They are dying through preventable illnesses, right? And so what this does provide, for example, the Maputo Protocol, is for us to remind our countries that we have a very progressive document for them to reference when they're making policies and designing programs on sexual and reproductive health and rights beyond just family planning. And I know, particularly speaking for young people, you have concepts like the demographic dividend. How can this translate in terms of advancing young women and girls, adolescent girls and young women? In East and Southern Africa, we have a very high disease burden for HIV and AIDS, particularly amongst adolescent girls and young women. So they die more, they get newly infected more, all because of things like, they face more violence, they rarely have access to comprehensive sexuality education. And so for me, it's an opportunity. As for anti-corruption, there's the issue of governance, and governance is part of what we were discussing earlier on, leadership. But also, how do we also see women as part of agents for challenging corruption in our society and also being more affected? When we lose money, for example, at Feminet, we've done an analysis, when we lose money through corruption, what we end up having is cuts for the gender programs. And so we need to be able to say that for us to have enough financing for gender equality, we have to cut back down on corruption. So we are not sacrificing women's rights at the expense.
We're going to talk about conflict and violence in this continent and how it affects women, the likes of Central African Republic and South Sudan. Jean-Paul, there's something important that Catherine mentioned, corruption and how it affects women. And if you look at the various research, the letters that was done by the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, they found out that in the county level, the areas that are most affected by corruption is health. And that in one way or another affects women in a big way, right?
Definitely, it affects women, in not only women, but even girls and children in a very, very, very big way. And this is because if you look at the whole array of health services, whether it is maternity, whether it is the basic health, when you go to a health center, if those facilities are not there because the money has been stolen or stashed away by somebody, then it means you are creating a hardship for women to access health, for children to access health, and that affects their development all through. For them to be productive economically, even in development of the country, they need to be able to access these services. And there are most basic services. For instance, even the recently introduced project of providing sanitary towels for school-going girls. I mean, these are basic health needs which, if are taken away by virtue of corruption, then you realize that the whole development and empowerment of the woman is affected. And this ultimately affects how this person, when they grow up and become adults, they are not able to equally participate with the male counterpart in terms of running for the opportunities and accessing economic opportunity and even employment, because when the health of the girl is affected, her education is affected, and therefore her economic empowerment at the end of the day is affected one way or another. So it's very true.
Catherine, conflict, violence, we've seen reports from Central African Republic, the latest indicating that about 1 million people have been displaced. Most of them are women and children. South Sudan, they've signed a deal just the other day. We hope things are going to be good there. But again, it's a country where women have been affected in a very big way. Do you think those in leadership have some sort of a role to make sure that, they put politics aside, violence aside for the sake of, their population, mainly women?
Yes, and one of the things that Maputo Protocol addresses is armed conflict, and women, one, are disproportionately affected, and rape being used as a weapon of war, but also thirdly, as women as agents of peace building and actors in the peace building process. And so what I know in South Sudan, we have a very intensive women's movement engaging in these peace processes. In Liberia, we actually have peace because of women, Lema Bowe and the previous Johnson Sirleaf. And so what this does is, one, it does to unpack to us as Africans who is being disproportionately affected, and how this, and the issue of conflict goes beyond just conflict in our countries, how this triggers migration, refugee crisis in neighboring countries. And I think what it does to spotlight for us is how we can address this collectively and how we can use Maputo Protocol and other documents to guide the rebuilding of the countries, to see women as governance actors, of course, and also start to address things like rape as a weapon of war. In DRC, in the parts where there is a conflict, we have 48 women raped in 2 minutes. By the time we finish,
2 minutes.
Yes. By the time we finish this conflict, we will have how many women raped?
Sure, that's a very disturbing statistics, Catherine. Now I'll give you both of you a minute each. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want us to finish on a high. Jean-Paul, let me start with you. Perhaps some of the milestones we've seen since that protocol was signed?
Yes, since the protocol was adopted, we've seen its provisions being read in judgments and also guiding decisions in the courts of law. We've seen legislations in different countries, like what I've mentioned in Kenya, and even our constitution. It was inspired by the protocol. We've seen it in the whole of Africa, and good enough, Equality Now also has a program in which we train lawyers all over the Africa on how to apply the protocol when they are filing cases in court affecting the rights of women and girls. So it's a document that needs to continue to be enforced and to be ratified by those countries which have not ratified. There are around 15, but there's also a campaign that Equality Now is spearheading through the SOA Coalition, the Solidarity for African Women Movements Coalition, to ensure that the whole of Africa ratifies it, but also adopts what we call a multi-sectoral approach in terms of implementing the provisions to ensure that all sectors of the government are able to work together to fulfill these rights of women.
Well said, Jean-Paul. Catherine, let me give you the last word.
I'll highlight two things. So two of the highlights we've had general comments on some of the articles of Maputo Protocol. The general comments do help government understand how to be able to contextualize the Maputo Protocol when making policies on specific issues. We have a general comment on the Article 14 on sexual reproductive health and rights, and the general comment on child marriage. It's a very new general comment. And so these are opportunities for countries to start looking as to how they can domesticate Maputo Protocol. And then secondly is, and I just mentioned, in the African Women's Decade by 2020, we had aspired to have all 55 countries ratified. So we really hope they can ratify. But then the next step is start reporting as to how they are progressing with the protocol and the challenges they are facing, so we can all collectively define how to move forward in terms of implementing the gender equality and women's empowerment agenda in Africa.
Thank you very much, Nyambura. You're a real Pan-Africanist, I must say. Thank you very much, Nyambura. She's from FarmNet, as well as Jean-Paul from Equality Now. Of course, that brings us